Hello, today I'm going to be making a pair of arrows. I'm going to show two methods, one of which you start with a sapling, the other one you start with a piece of scrap wood. You want to pick a sapling that's about 3/8 of an inch or half an inch. You want to pick a relatively straight sapling that has no major knots. Winter is the best time to cut live wood because all the sap is in the roots, which means that you won't have to cure the saplings for very long before using them. The first step is to determine the length. You can do this by just holding a tape measure out like you're drawing a bow, or by holding the piece of wood like it's a finished arrow and just marking it, or by taking half of your height and subtracting the length of your middle finger. For cutting off the sapling, you're going to want to use a fine saw so that you get a nice clean edge. You should also position the cuts so that you get the best section of the sapling. Now I'm going to go over the sapling and remove the bark. I'm just using a pocket knife for this. Just going around trying to take off anything that will come off easily. When I come to a knot, I swing the knife with a little bit of force so that it just sails right through it. Just going to go over and take off all the knots and uneven sections and then round out the corners there. Once I've got the worst of the bark off, I'm going to turn the knife perpendicular to the piece of wood and use it like a cabinet scraper to get all of the little pieces. You don't have to be perfect about this. If there's some little pieces of bark left at the end of this, it'll be fine. Some little bits of bark won't affect the performance, it'll just affect how quickly it dries out. Once that's done, you can start straightening it. You can see that there's some little bends in the piece now. Not ideal. If you're working with a dead sapling or something that's been cured, you're either going to need to steam it or soak it in hot water for a while before you start bending it. Green wood can be bent immediately. The way I bend it is just the simplest thing possible, just against the knee. I just locate each bend, and then I press it against the knee until it's straight. Then I move along the arrow and do so for each section of it until the whole thing is more or less straight. A sapling is a little bit like a spring, and it will go back into its normal bent shape after a little while, so you're going to do this a little bit every day until it's fully dry. Once it's fully dry, it should stay straight without you having to rebend it. If you're in a hurry, you can do the bending in front of a fire, but it's a little bit less forgiving even though it's a lot faster. The only thing to make sure of is that you don't overheat it. If you overheat it, you'll fire harden the wood and make it a little bit more brittle. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, it just has to be more or less straight. Tiny little bends will only affect your accuracy by a tiny little bit. I'll continue to work on this over the next couple of days. In the meantime, let's go start on the other arrow. The next arrow I make, I'm going to cut out of a piece of scrap wood. I'm using cedar because it's light and flexible. This first piece has got a number of big knots, so I'm not going to use it. The second piece has got big knots on 3 out of 4 corners. I could theoretically get an arrow out of this, but I'm not going to use this piece because it's not ideal. You want a piece of wood with no major knots, relatively straight grain, and no grain runoff. Or rather, I should say you want a section of wood. You can get a lot of arrows out of a single piece, so the piece itself doesn't have to be perfect, just a small portion of it. This is the method that I usually use to make arrows. I don't like cutting saplings, and it's easier to get a perfectly straight arrow with this method anyway. Dead wood is completely guilt-free. It even has a positive environmental impact because this arrow is going to be stored in a quiver rather than rotting or burning and releasing its CO. This last scrap is the one we're going to be using. It's got some knots and some nail holes, but it's got one edge that is almost perfectly clean. I'm going to use a table saw to rip a 3/8 of an inch slice out of the good side of this piece. Here's the slice. It looks pretty good. Pretty straight grain with very little runoff. Now without adjusting the saw, I'm going to lay the piece flat and rip it into a 3/8 of an inch square. So now I've got a couple of square dowels. In order to make these into round dowels, I'm going to clamp them in my vise with the corner up and then use a plane to take off the top. The plane should prevent you from gouging the piece too badly. You want to go up and down and all around the piece and work it down from a square into an octagon. You want to make sure that each of the sides is relatively the same width. Don't worry too much if it's a little bit rough, you're going to be fixing that later. Next I'm going to be working the arrow in a tool of my own devising. This is just a scrap of trim with a coarse piece of sandpaper glued down to it. This lets you apply a lot more pressure than if you were just to use the sandpaper by hand. The round flat sanding surface also ensures that your arrows are going to be pretty much perfect. Whereas if you sand by hand alone, you're going to follow the contours of the arrow. When you're finished, it should look like just a normal piece of dowel. It's best if it's perfectly round, but if it's a little bit angular, it shouldn't matter. I'm also going to work the sapling arrow in this same tool just to take off any high spots. Some sections like knots are really difficult to bend properly, so it's easier sometimes to just sand it down into straight. After this, I'm going to go over both the arrows by hand, using a slightly finer grit of sandpaper. Not really doing any real shaping here, just trying to get it nice and smooth. It'll fly better if it's more polished, but you don't have to get it perfect. Each grit of sandpaper provides exponentially less benefit, so whereas with most projects I would advocate the standard policy of coarse, medium, fine, here I just go with coarse and then call it quits. You might lose this arrow after only one shot, so there's no point in being too persnickety about it. Now that the shafts are done, it's time to start turning them from a dowel into an arrow. First by carving it to attach the arrowheads we made in the previous video. First I'm going to be using the steel arrowhead. I'm going to start by cutting a notch with a very precise hacksaw. The notch should be the same depth as the length of the arrowhead's tang. The cut is a little bit too narrow to fit the arrowhead in without splitting the shaft, so I'm just going to widen it, just using the hacksaw to scrape down the sides of the cut. If you've got a thicker arrowhead, you might want to use a rasp for this. Let's give that a try. And there we go, the arrowhead fits fine. For the sake of showing a different technique, for this other arrow I'm going to attach the antler tip. You do this simply by whittling down the tip of the arrow. You want to try and match the inside of the arrowhead as closely as possible, but if you don't get it perfect, that's fine. You can just fill it with glue and string. Something worth noting here is that this is the stage at which you decide which end of the arrow is the tip. I like to put the base of the sapling, that is the thickest, strongest, heaviest portion of the arrow shaft, towards the tip. I find that this makes it fly better. It also makes it less likely to break when it hits something hard. You're finished when the arrowhead will fit onto the full depth of the socket. You did a good job if it will stay on just from friction. Now it's time for the nocks. If you're working with a scrap wood arrow, you want to orient the nocks perpendicular to the grain of the wood to help resist splitting. I like to have them cut to about 1/4 of an inch deep. Shallower than that and you're a little bit more likely to get a bad release when you shoot. Deeper than that and the nocks become a little bit too delicate. I'm cutting 2 grooves with the hacksaw to get the appropriate width for the nock. After which I'm going to join the corners of the 2 separate cuts together so that they form the shape seen on the screen here. This should allow you to break the little pieces out just by wiggling the saw blade. After which I'm going to use my pocket knife to just clean up the edges a little bit. You could also do this with a rasp. You got a slightly lower risk of failure, but the pocket knife is faster. So there you have it, that's the nocks cut out. Now we're going to start attaching everything together. To glue everything together I'm going to be using hide glue. Hide glue is better than most modern alternatives because it's easy to clean up when you make a mess. To prepare it you just add water to the powder and then boil it for a little while. I'm using a makeshift double boiler here. This prevents it from burning. First I'm going to be attaching the antler arrowhead. This is pretty straightforward. You just lather up the tip of the shaft with glue. Then you fill the socket of the arrowhead with glue and then you just stick it on. Now I'm taking a piece of sinew thread and wrapping the shaft of the arrow just below the head. The arrowhead is a little bit bigger than the shaft, so this provides a little bit more surface area for it to bite to. You want to use unwaxed, genuine sinew rather than the fake stuff for this. Real sinew binds with the hide glue really well. Once you've got it wrapped, you're just going to go over it with more hide glue, make sure that it's soaked into every little nook and cranny in the sinew. It isn't worth the hassle of trying to tie off the loose end of the sinew, just hold it down in the hide glue until it sticks. This is what I like most about hide glue. Because it's soluble in warm water, you can use your hands to apply it and then just wash it off. That arrowhead is attached, so we're just going to set it aside to dry while we work on the next one. To begin with, I'm going to start by taking a piece of string and tying it into a slip knot. Then I loop the slip knot around the shaft just below the notch. Then I take the arrowhead and coat the tang very thoroughly in hide glue. You want a really thick layer. Then you slide the 2 pieces together, after which you coat the entire thing very thoroughly in hide glue. Then you take the end of that slip knot and you start wrapping it around the tang. You want to make sure to get it into every one of those little notches that you carved into the side of the tang. Just keep going around and around, back and forth until you run out of string. After which you again coat the whole thing in hide glue and then press the ends of the string down until they stick. Now it's time for the flights. You want to use the feathers of a big bird like a turkey or a goose. Chicken feathers don't work very well. You want long, relatively straight feathers. I'm using 2 different colors of feather to make it easy to tell which way to orient the arrow in the bow. These feathers are a little bit ragged and worn out, so I'm just going to cut out the best sections I can from each of them. Under ideal circumstances, you can get 2 flights from 1 feather. Once you've got some sections cut out, you can hold them against each other to measure out the next sections. You want all 3 flights on each arrow to be more or less the same length. Now that I've got all the pieces cut out, I'm using my pocket knife to split the quills down the middle. This will give a nice concave shape to sit against the arrow shaft, and it'll provide something spongy for the glue to hold onto. You want to be very, very careful here. You want to apply almost no pressure to the quill at all. Just very lightly, very gently rocking the knife back and forth inside the quill. If you apply more than just the tiniest little bit of pressure, it's very easy to slip and wreck the feather, or worse, slice into your thumb. I'm also trying to have things angled so that if I do slip, the knife is going to hit my nail and glance off rather than going into the meat of my thumb. Injuring yourself is counterproductive, and I do not recommend it. Take your time, do it slow, do it right. You're not trying to cut the feather apart, you're just trying to lever it apart. Now the flights are going to require a little bit of shaping. I'm going to snip away the feathers about 1/4 of an inch at the top and the bottom of each quill. This will give me a little ledge to use when I tie the feathers to the shaft. When I hold my flights together, I can see that they're a slightly different shape. So I'm going to trim down the larger one so that it matches. This is also good for aerodynamics, right? You want nice even transitions rather than these large chisel-like feathers. It's also a good idea to trim down the worst of the rough edges. Attaching the flights is an absolute nightmare. I am very bad at this step. Normally I just close my eyes, throw all the pieces together, and hope the pain stops. This is the step where it really matters that hide glue is water soluble, because you're going to get it on your hands, you're going to get it on the flights, you're going to get it on your clothes, and all over the table. It's a terrible step. That's not very useful for a tutorial though, so here goes. What you should do is slather the shaft in hide glue, hold them there until the glue dries enough that they're comfortably tacked. Try not to get too much glue on the feathers. If you get more than a little bit, it will affect their performance. After that, I take a slip knot, which I definitely remembered to prepare beforehand, slide it over the very ends of the quills, and pull it tight. Trying to be very gentle on the feathers all the while so that I don't shift them too much, or worse, pull them off of the glue altogether. After which I begin rotating the arrow to wrap the tips of the quills down. Then I re-glue everything and repeat on the back end. Once you've managed to muddle your way through that, you just set them down on a nice flat surface with the center supported, and let them dry. You can clean up any glue drips later when things are nice and solid. So here they are, 2 finished arrows. The scrap one turned out very well, the sapling one is a little bit bent but not too bad. A couple of days later and they should be solid enough to use, so let's try them out. Wasn't aiming at anything particular here, but they both went in generally the same area, so aiming for the center top here. Yeah, they're both pretty good. So I guess there's nothing more to say, so we'll end it here. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting. Bye-bye.